It's October 7th. The topic today will be about the Alberta economy and economic recovery. We have as the Deputy Chief Economist, Robert Roach, who will be joining us today to give you his perspective on Alberta, the economy, et cetera. But before I start probing him and getting into an interview, I want to ask everybody, watch muting, raise your hand if you've got a question, or use the chat function. Don't hesitate discussing with one another topics and making comments. I'll be asking Robert to give us a little bit of color about who he is, and getting into the economy, and maybe even a little bit about banking itself and its future. So without any further ado, Robert, welcome.
Thanks, Perry, for having me, and hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
When I read your CV, which most people, if they've read our newsletter, have got a little bit of background. You're the Deputy Chief Economist with the bank, ATB. It's an Alberta-based bank. How did you get into this profile? You're enthusiastic. You've got a can-do attitude. How did you find yourself getting into the job that you're in today? Well,
it has been, I think, like many careers, a bit of a circuitous route. My original career focus was public policy broadly defined. So I worked for the Canada West Foundation for almost 20 years. And what happened early on, and interestingly, we're going to get into this in the discussion, is economic diversification of Western Canada was one of the first topics I worked on in the early 90s. There's one of our publications from not that long ago. So what happened early on at the Canada West Foundation is we had a lot of economists working with us, for us, or on contract or as advisors. And I really started to get into that side of the public policy work, and started to focus a lot on the, not just Alberta, but particularly the 4 Western provinces and the Canadian economy. Did a lot of work on trade with the United States, internal trade, the energy sector, agriculture. So it was a really kind of an on-the-job learning from I had the opportunity to learn from some of the biggest and brightest economic and business minds. And that combination of the theoretical with the actual business owners, people who are wealth creators, and the policymakers. So all of that was really where I got, I think, my best education. And then so I spent 20 years at ATB, a nice long chunk of time, but thought it was time finally. Some people change jobs much more often than that, but finally thought it was time for a change. And Todd Hirsch, who I had worked with at Canada West Foundation and is a good friend of mine and co-author, he had an opportunity to bring someone on at ATB to do deeper research on particular economic topics. And I started there almost 7-8 years ago now, and just hung around and learned more and more and more about the Alberta economies. And not that long ago, only been about a year and a half, where I've moved into the deputy chief role, managing more of the day-to-day operations of ATB economics and the forecasting, and but still trying to keep an eye, as Todd is the expert on, those bigger picture themes around how to make Alberta a prosperous place over the long term. So a lot of on-the-job training is where I'm coming from.
Well, that background with Canada West Foundation was clearly a great platform to get off on. I mean, I have a lot of regard for what Roger Gibbons had done in the years past. And it clearly is a great foundation to get an understanding of the Western Canadian economy. So the Western Canadian economy has some very unique features to it, and it's hard sometimes to understand, for Canadians to understand, how different the Western Canadian, particularly Alberta economy, is relative to the country as a whole. Why don't you give me your perspective on what is an economy anyway? I mean, if we're going to talk economics today, or the economy, I think we should be grounded in getting some understanding of what we mean when we talk about, quote, the economy.
Yeah, it's a great question, Barry. I mean, there's lots of different definitions, and everything from home economics, that sort of root concept of managing the resources of your home. But I think a pretty good standard definition, it's that interrelated set. You've got production, consumption, and exchange. And it's how all that works together. And because we have scarcity, only so many resources to go around, you develop different methods, systems, approaches, habits of how to make those things work together to exchange and deal with that scarcity. So, and that tends to fit with, I think we're talking about economies at a provincial or national or global level. But, this can apply to smaller, parts of a city, regions, and different sectors. But the way I tend to, the area I work in is those larger economies like a province or the Canadian economy.
Another cut on it, maybe it's a cut the same way, but using in different terms, is commodities, services, and manufacturing. Is that archaic, or is that still relevant to think?
I think it's still very relevant, and it's a lot of it's the choices we make and have made over time. And one thing that I always like to, whenever I'm thinking about the economy, it is not a central, there has been efforts to centralize economies, and it can work to some degree. We have a mixed economy here in Canada, but generally speaking, it's the millions and billions of interactions every day between people, businesses, services, production, decisions, capital. It really is a very dispersed system that happens. And one of the mistakes we make, not that we shouldn't often try, but trying to control that. And I'm not arguing that we should leave everything to the market, but there's no central brain commanding that, even when we try to impose one on it. So that's a fairly classic understanding of the economy. Others might have a very different view, but that I think tends to be what happens on the ground.
You've touched on an important point that I think many people misunderstand, that economics is not like physics or chemistry. The laws that relate to economics is a reason why it's in the liberal arts department, why businesses in the liberal, there's a sociology or a social dimension to commerce. It's not a transaction that necessarily abides by the laws of physics, but more by the laws of human behavior individually or collectively.
And it is as complex as putting billions of human beings together. And no wonder we struggle to, we try to understand it. And there are I think a lot of, economics has done a lot of work over the years to develop some good laws, some good theories, supply and demand, those kind of things that do help us understand. And they're hard to get around. They really do give us some grounding, but you're right, Perry. That's what I would stress. It's not a system you can make a decision on and turn it like you might be able to do. And that's true for a lot of areas of human life, but particularly the economy.
Economies are also not static. Not only are they dynamic on a day-to-day basis, but they evolve. What's going on in Nigeria today, or what might be going on in Latin America, will differ and may in fact even have different political structures to regulate those systems based on where they are in the economic evolution.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so here we are in Western Canada, more specifically Alberta. Alberta has issues. One of the issues that the Canada West Foundation was very keen to address was the issue of diversification. Going back several years to Peter Lougheed, who in the very early days of the contemporary economy of Alberta made a very big point that as we were evolving as a province around the clear benefits of commodities, wheat, meat, fiber, timber, oil, and gas, we need to be conscious of the importance of diversifying the economy. So our first question in our survey relates to the whatever economy the respondents happen to be in, but in this case, Alberta. Is the Alberta economy diversified? That is it adequately structured that we can expect to see reasonable recovery and also resilience to significant economic shocks? What would be your viewpoint on that? And what do you want to share with us?
Yeah, there's a lot packed into that one question. And I'll start with a little bit going back. You mentioned Peter Lougheed, and one of the things in the early days of diversification, there was a couple things going on. One, back then, the fear was quite legitimate that we'd run out. We'd run out of oil and gas. And so it wasn't diversification. Partly it was driven by that. Like, we need a substitute, and there's a clock ticking of quite fast. Fast forward, and now the problem, we've got a lot of natural gas in the ground, the third largest oil reserves in the oil sands. So the issue is different today, but back then that was part of it. The other side of it was there was a sense, and if you look at some of the language back in the 80s and 70s, there was a sense of an inferiority complex, that a good economy looked more like Ontario, that you needed a manufacturing base, that there was something inferior about a natural resource-based economy. And there was some truth to that around the volatility and maybe the seeming lack of sophistication. I think we've also, I hope, not everybody, but out here at least, we understand that's not the case. It's a very sophisticated, very profitable natural resources, and that base, whether it's agriculture, oil and gas, forestry, etc., is a positive thing. So that was kind of operating in the past. So we fast forward to today, and I think the concern is not around we're going to run out, but now it's changed to we're not going to be allowed, or we're going to choose not to develop our resources, especially on the hydrocarbon fossil fuel side, because of environmental concerns, climate change. Whether that's your choice or you feel the world is moving in that direction. And the second concern is that we've always had this volatility. That's been there for years. It is an up and down. We're at the mercy of OPEC and other forces we can't control. Natural gas is a great example. In the mid-2000s, it was absolutely a powerhouse, a part of our economy, still significant and important. But then fracking and the shale revolution changed that game. So we're always wrestling with the volatility of prices and change in the natural resource sector. And the third thing we're now working on, and it's always been there, but it's, well, can we do something else that's just positive? Not because we're worried about our natural resource base being questioned or not being able to grow, not because of volatility, but just because we'd like to have more jobs, better jobs, a higher standard of living, more prosperity for more people. And so it depends on which one of those lenses you're looking at diversification through. And in terms of, so that's sort of some context. The second piece of context is I do think we are more diversified in Alberta than we were 40 years ago. But because the economy has grown, our oil and gas sector is much bigger. We are producing more oil by double than we did in the 80s in terms of barrels per day. So they both grown together. So when you look at the pie, the chunk that is still oil and gas still remains very, very large. But we have more industries, more diverse industries, services, products, manufacturing than we did in the 80s, but it's all grown together. So in terms of that pie chart, we're not seeing a wildly different sort of basic picture of the economy. So that's another piece of the context. One other thing, I always tell this to our friends in Ontario, is we have to always appreciate the magnitude of what we're trying to shift away from or add on to or replace part of. So our oil and gas sector, if you took manufacturing sector in Ontario, its GDP on an annual basis, so not auto parts and auto, that's only one part of manufacturing, their entire manufacturing sector, our oil and gas sector in Alberta, just the extraction part is the same size in terms of GDP. So when we talk about, we want to add on, diversify, change our economy, we have to, even if a small sliver we have to replace or try to move the dial in terms of the proportions, it's a huge piece of our economy. Second, economic diversification is not natural. That doesn't mean we can't do it. We can go against nature in this sense, but there's a reason after a lot of hard work and so forth, we have oil and gas economy in Alberta is we have oil and gas. The Okanagan has wine. This is a truism around the world. You can overcome it, but it's not natural for us. There's no particular reason Alberta would have been a tech center. Or in the past, we've tried new things that weren't necessarily, we tried to pick winners and develop new industries. It's hard to do that. Everyone wants to be a tech sector. Everyone wants to attract talent. Everyone wants to grow their pharmaceuticals, their service sector, their healthcare services. So it's a highly competitive and almost unnatural thing to do. And that's why the last piece of context I wanted to introduce is it's a very slow process. You can do a lot of entrepreneurial activity, a lot of new startups, a lot of new businesses, and you'll make progress. But at the end of the year, it's not going to add up to $100 billion of economic output that we would need to. We're not going to replace oil and gas, but that would be the total equivalent. So you put all that together, and sorry, Perry, this is a long-winded answer, but I think we have made progress. We are facing, even if you're in the camp that wants to double down on oil and gas, there are forces actively and have successfully put a lid on our production, our ability to grow and transport our products. So we have to deal with that. And I also take the view that diversification, it is because we want more jobs and a better economy, rather than this defensive position of, we're trying to repair something that's wrong with our economy. Keeping in mind, we do have challenges around our number one industry is under duress. I hope that was a not too long of an answer, Barry. Hopefully I did answer part of the question at least.
Well, look, when we do surveys, we do get long-winded answers, but I think the bottom line in this discussion has been one, we've made progress. That is apparent in the survey work that we've done. And by the way, the survey work is based on sentiment, not based on measuring something concrete, although I'll get to that in a moment. Secondly, it's overwhelming that when we ask people the question about diversification, the first thing we get into a discussion about is oil and gas. And yet the reality is, it's not so much oil and gas as extraction or as production or distribution. It's how oil and gas has penetrated so many different industries, whether it be tourism and hospitality and hotels in Peace River, whether it be metals and materials, whether it be construction, whether it be where labor is going, whether it is who are graduating from our universities. I mean, the oil and gas industry has penetrated so many aspects of the economy as a whole that what we see in the data is that the price of oil has a significant bearing on many aspects of the Alberta economy, individually and collectively. So overall, when one asks, are you diversified? Yes, we've made progress and we're getting there. That's the good news, but we're not there yet. And there are many industries that are watching and that are affected. Now we get to oil and gas and how slow it is. There's no economy that we can identify in the world that has been able to diversify off oil and gas successfully. And Texas, as a jurisdiction, probably comes the closest, and yet it is still heavily reliant on the oil and gas industry. And we see what's happening in the Middle East as they recognize they've got to get into tourism or other sectors than just oil and gas. So I think what we're seeing in our survey and what you've echoed is reflective of, I think, what we are living through. When we ask, where are we going? Well, we've been very aspirational in the past, but now we're confronted by not the forces and sources of change of how to grow our business, but how to transition our business so that we are not simply into the extraction and distribution, but that we're either using the product for value added, or we're cleaning up our act so that the value is increased because the demand for clean product is a whole new market. And if we're going to continue to be in the market that we're in, we have to modify our product and our processes in order to comply with a whole new way of thinking, which is a newfound respect for the environment.
And I'm probably a little more optimistic than Todd. I think Todd is and rightly so, concerned that we have to move fast, because even though it's unfair, I think it's unfair. We've been targeted. The oil sands have been targeted. And so we are backed into a corner where we have to find some alternatives, whether it's doing partly, we are an excellent producer of fossil fuels, and we keep sending that message out and we keep getting blank stares back, and misinformation. So that's a tough road. But an optimistic side of this is we are excellent at energy, and so there's been talk of clean energy and how we can thermal, different options within our energy sector. And that goes back to one of the old debates, kind of just before climate change changed the situation, was should we be diversifying within our areas of expertise, agriculture, so more bio technology and agriculture science and so forth, within energy, because we have all this expertise. And like you said, for years, graduates out of our schools, they went into the oil patch. There's all that brain power, engineering power. Can it be applied within energy? And then there's this other sort of argument as well, nothing wrong with that, but we also need to find areas that counterbalance that, where we're in another sector altogether so that we're not always tied to that same up and down fortunes within energy. So I think there's opportunities across the board, and within energy and outside it, and also globally, to diversify our markets, not just our products.
Well, the headline or the bottom line for all of this is transition, whether it's into something brand new or modifying the industries or the economies that we're in right now. The one word that captures it all is transition, and maybe along with that, leadership. And anytime you're making a transition, you're facing change management. The oil and gas industry is very capital intensive. And how do you walk away from pipelines? How do you walk away from rail lines? How do you walk away from the infrastructure that costs billions and has been capitalized over decades? Mm-hmm. How do you just simply walk away from that and say, well, all those investors go to hell. We're in transition because Greta Thunberg has got a following.
And I think that's a good word, transition, because we are in the oil and gas business. And one of the things that I think has changed, there's a great cartoon, it's from a children's dictionary, and it shows there's a hole in the roof of a cabin, and the sun is shining, and so the little animals say to each other, well, we should fix the roof. But they're like, oh, the sun is shining. And so that's when oil prices are high, capital investment into oil and gas is high, we're booming. Then it starts to rain, and they say, well, we can't fix that hole right now because it's raining, we'll have to wait. And of course, that's when we have a bust in Alberta and there's no money around, there's no, things are in recession, so we can't do it then. What I think has changed is two things. First, we have high prices, it's helping our economy, and hopefully, high natural gas prices won't go too high because we're also consumers and there's other effects, but a strong price environment for oil and gas is going to really help our sector recover. We can fill up the pipeline capacity we have, hopefully get Trans Mountain completed and still be able to get a little bit more product to market. But at the same time, we're not seeing the type of capital expenditure, the spending we did. Now, at first, over the last year, oil companies have put money back into, they had a tough year, of course, repairing their balance sheets, paying back debt, dividends, buying back shares, because the industry knows there's only so much production we can grow. We're stymied by the transportation challenge. Excuse me. And capital has also been a bit nervous about coming in because of the pandemic, because of climate change and ESG. So that's changed. We're not going to see the boom, even though we've got these high prices. I think that'll help convince people to work on that hole in the roof. And also, I think people, the sense in the province is that we finally do, with this climate change challenge, we finally have to fix that hole in the roof. We can't keep just waiting for that next cycle of boom. For the next boom.
Robert, if we had had this discussion 2 or 3 weeks ago, I would have simply nodded my head and we would have gone on to the next question. But I have to hesitate for a moment, because the oil and gas industry always had great hope when the industry was down and euphoria when it was up. And this instance, what's been going on the last few years has given some sense that we've got a transition that's not going to come back. Well, in the last 3 weeks, with the price of natural gas and the shortages that are going on, and either as a byproduct of increased demand or issues of logistics, we have all of a sudden that rising price again. And the risk is that we abandon transition and we go right back to what we've been doing for so well in the past, and we forget what we almost got ready to do or got in the process of doing, which was that transition, as opposed to, as Eric Newell said to me once before, harvest when the sun is shining. Forget diversification.
And it does tend to be a magnet that pulls attention and energy, because if the goose is laying an egg, a nice golden egg, you don't walk away from it. What I do think is different, and I could easily be wrong, and natural gas is a little bit different, but on the oil side, we really are stymied. I think back, back in about 2008, 2009, 2010, the TMX, the Northern Gateway, I should say, pipeline, and a number of oil producers in Alberta, we had a meeting at Canada West Foundation, and they said, we don't need to worry. There is absolutely no doubt. There is no scenario in the world that Northern Gateway won't get built. It's in Canada's interest. It's in the oil patch's interest. It's in consumers' interests. And Stephen Harper will get it done, period. Well, what I think has changed is we now realize that, and I think in the sector, there's this realization that between opposition to physical pipelines, between global climate policy and whether it's posturing or real, and between some technological changes. I'm not an expert on electric vehicles, and I know that's a highly debatable subject, but things that could change some of the dynamics, we are constrained. And I think the sector is saying we are going to be disciplined. We are going to grow as much as we can, but we're going to have to, we're just not going to be able to grow Alberta's production the way we could have. And I think Albertans, it behooves us to say, we really do need to keep working on diversification as a defensive strategy against that, because we're not going to get that same growth. It's still there, but not the same level, but also because there's just other economic opportunities. Why wouldn't we? We've got a great place to live, a great population. There's capital that can be attracted here. Why couldn't we break into and expand on areas we're already in just because it's a good idea? So I wouldn't want it all to be because we have to deal with what's happening in oil and gas. I do think that takes away some of the momentum of these are just good ideas. Let's create innovation here in Alberta and grow businesses. We should just do that because it's a good idea.
Before I jump into what you've just articulated as a solution, which is the word innovation, and I've laid out the word transition before that, I want to discuss just for a moment what the economy means and what it is we've been talking about. When you talk to mom and pop from Rimby, or you talk to our network, they're not talking the language of an economist. They're talking about, well, what are they talking about? They talk about jobs. They might understand capital investment because they understand something about debt and banks and the need for money in order to make a difference. So when Albertans and when Trudeau and when any politician talks about the economy, they don't use the word economics. They talk jobs, period.
Yep. So
when you're talking about the economy, there are a lot of jobs in Alberta that are oil and gas dependent, but there are many in agriculture and forestry and increasingly technology. But then there's an awful lot of jobs in government as well. Let's talk for a minute about what the structure of an economy is when we talk about different sectors. What do we have in Alberta besides oil and gas?
Well, I think this is good to remember too, because we're the province that we follow the news, and what's WTI today is a common question, but we're a modern service economy. Now we are tilted compared to the national economy, especially in central Canada. We're still tilted. We have a larger resource base as a proportion, but we're still, healthcare, education, and the whole service economy, financial services, real estate. That's still the largest overall component of our economy. Our large cities, our urban economy. So what's different about Alberta, of course, is we are weighted we had that large oil and gas piece, somewhat larger agricultural slice as a proportion. But we still have all these other areas. And it is difficult because on the one hand, I always want to remember, and there's a great story from a few years ago. We were interviewing a small company up in Red Deer, and they do corporate logos on shirts and caps and water bottles. And their business was suffering. And we said, well, how come? And he said, well, it's because the oil and gas companies aren't spending any money. It was the front end of the 2015, 2016 recession. So his business, seemingly unrelated, as you mentioned earlier, Harry, around, it's not an oil and gas sector business. It's manufacturing shirts and hats and logos on them. But how deep those connections can be, you mentioned hotels and small communities. It's those service workers, oil and gas service workers coming through who are staying there that keep them viable throughout the year. So on the one hand, I don't want to take away from just how big those base keystone industries are. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people in Alberta who work in technical jobs, who work in law, real estate, and one, a sector that I'm in, which is financial services, and it's one our current government, I think wisely, like almost every other government everywhere, but Alberta does have a legitimate chance at this, is to really grow our financial services sector. We've got this capital base that we've had in the oil and gas sector. That's an opportunity, also a bit of a challenge, but we're the type of place between Calgary and Edmonton, if we do this right, that's a sector we could grow, and it's entirely services. It's a service sector that Alberta could grow. Entertainment sector, there's issues there with trying to compete to maybe spend too many tax dollars to attract film and so forth. But nonetheless, those types of industries, health services, no reason Alberta can't compete, globally on those areas. So we are different, but we also have those years of prosperity have built up a great infrastructure in the province, a great population, highly educated, great cities. I mean, we complain, but we've got a lot of advantages in Alberta. We just have to play those cards carefully, and we can really do it.
The commodity sectors, which we've spent a lot of time on now, although we haven't articulated agriculture and forestry, are revenue generators. We take an asset, we extract it, we produce it, we distribute it, and we get revenue back. But one of the sector's services is a consumer or consumption of that revenue. And I refer specifically to what in Canada we want to call our public service sector, which is health and education and government itself. When I was in Ottawa, I was stunned to look at some of the figures and realize that better than 50% of the expenditures in Canada are for government services, health, education. I'm not sure how innovative they are. They're not driven by market forces, or they're driven by whatever the politician within a 4-year period feels they can or can't get votes for. How reliant are we in Alberta on the health, education, and government sector when we talk about diversification? Is that not a drain? Is that not pulling capital away that we could otherwise be investing in the innovations that we require?
It's a great question, and I think part of the answer is when I think of, you're right, health education, there's the public service side of that. And it's the biggest part. I mean, that's where the billions of dollars are spent.
Right.
Hospitals, primary care, K-12 education, university funding. But the opportunities, I think, are in health and education are things like providing health services to a global market, developing, we don't have a pharmaceutical industry in Alberta of any significance, but where we can actually develop products or services or ideas, or the services could also be in terms of management, in terms of, it doesn't always have to be making things. It can be that idea generating, knowledge-based, the designers, the coders. And I think health and education, if we can think of the products and services that can be sold worldwide, Same thing with financial services, and tech broadly defined. Same thing with agriculture. We've got food products. How can we market those, transform those in ways that the growing global middle class is going to want to buy from us? So that, whereas the public service side, sorry, Vic, go ahead.
I'm going to interrupt you right there, because your mindset is about health, education, and even many of the processes that go with government as a potential revenue generator, if we can find markets for our management and our knowledge about how to run them. But the reality is those sectors are heavily driven by those wanting to protect jobs.
Yep.
They're very status quo minded. They're not interested in change. They're interested in serving people and arguing that as a profession, each one of them exists to help you as an individual. They don't want to be rethinking that as an economic engine. They want to be thinking it as a service engine. So we're up against this tension between status quo to maintain services for people versus we've got to be thinking about the future and how this demand is a demand driven by market forces that is a phenomenal revenue potential.
Yeah, I think it helps to separate those two things, because take healthcare, with the aging of the population and better techniques, better technology, it costs more. We're able to keep people alive longer. Thankfully, I'm looking forward to this. But that comes with additional spending. That is, there are real jobs there and there's opportunities there. It's not like it's wasted money. But you're right, that's not where I think the diversification is going to come from. It's going to come from entrepreneurs and businesses who are finding, health services, technology they can sell to the Americans or to customers in Asia that allows them to run their healthcare system more efficiently.
Okay,
so it's separate from primary care and actual public service.
We have a conflict here, because the owner, the responsible steward of a health and education system is government. And you talk about we need to keep these two things separate, but they're not separate. So what role can government play in diversifying the economy when a large section of it is under the domain of the stewardship of government? Now,
well, that brings us to the other big theme always associated with diversification is who's going to do it.
Right.
When we say we need to diversify the economy, who is the they? Who is the we? And I'm a bit old school on this. Well, maybe this isn't old school. Old school might have been government is the answer. And I tend to think of it, and I'm getting this from other people much smarter than me. You've got one end of the continuum where government just does nothing. I don't think that's a viable or a very positive view of what we can do together in terms of public policy on this. You've got the other end, which we did try many times in Alberta, where we try to pick winners. Government will take tax money, heritage fund. This was also one of the themes. We'll take the oil and gas revenue, public revenue, and we'll fund diversification through that. Sounds great on paper. It didn't work particularly well. Now, some would say that funding did lead to the innovation that has allowed the oil sands to develop. It did lead to some other things where our cancer research sector in Alberta is quite strong. But overall, those two ends of the continuum, government should just stay out of it or they need to do it, are not good choices. It is somewhere in between. And it's the things government is good at or needs to be good at, which is things like keeping trade open within Canada, open internationally, making sure the ease of doing business. I know this is an issue down here in Calgary, probably is in Edmonton with the municipal elections. How can businesses be able to just cut through the red tape? Not anti-regulation, not anti-standards, but just so you can start a business, run it efficiently and quickly. Education, now that is a public spend, but it is one, if it's done right, that's where you're going to get that base of expertise. Education doesn't make entrepreneurs, but it certainly helps. And it's highly tied to the labor force we're going to need. So I think there's things government can do. Research and development funding, again, not picking, this is where it gets tricky, not picking what to spend it on, but creating, you talk about the innovation ecosystem, which I think is such a great metaphor, great idea, because it's all those pieces. You've got government, business, education, networks, relationships, funders, all have to kind of work together. The problem is this is a long-term complex project, and we kind of want it to happen now. But we need to think of this as a 10, 20-year project of diversification.
Therein lies one of the challenges that we have when we talk about the role of government, is the 4-year cycle and the capacity to stay the course in order to complete a transition, which may not necessarily be popular, when in fact it's having an impact on people's services. The survey work, though, echoes very much what you say. When we ask our network what the role of government, they're quite clear. It's in the policy formulation. It's not in the heavy spending. When they talk about spending, they talk about research, but they also talk about providing an environment that is stimulating for the SMEs, the survival, the growth, and the retention of our small business sector, which they view as fundamental for stirring innovation. Because so many others are the sun is shining, they're making money, they're not necessarily interested in tomorrow. And so they're not necessarily adopters of innovation, where the small businessman is more of a risk, or businesswoman is more of a risk taker. So you've touched on that, the role of government being more in policy and conflicted by the fact that it is so heavily involved in direct service delivery. Now, when I've echoed this, I don't think I've ever mentioned to you, but much of the network has heard me make this comment, that when I was director of privatization and funding reform with the Alberta government, I told them, you do not have to put a regulation in place to drive privatization. The market will pull you there, and technology is taking us there. So what we refer to as personalization or digitization is making it possible to customize services and thereby get out of having a heavily regulated public oversight and allowing market forces to play more of a role in the delivery of health and education. But just the words themselves put in the same sentence are inflammatory for many Canadians. But, like it or not, digitization and personalization is going to pull us into space that we didn't appreciate during nation building, but I think we'll see more of in the future. Do you want to comment on anything that I've just pontificated about?
I mean, I love this stuff, Barry, because I mean, these are such important and big sticky themes. And innovation, it gets used a lot, rightly so. It's that creative, and it doesn't always have to be brand new. I think there's this sense that you have to reinvent the wheel every time, but that's not what innovation and creativity and economic growth are always about. Sometimes it is, it's that light bulb. But if I could figure out how to maneuver those different parts of the system, I'd be rich, because you've put your finger right on the challenges. And this discussion and so many others like it, and other people working on it, I hope moves things a little bit forward. But it's such a big, daunting project. I think how we can break it down into small pieces without losing the big project, that it can't just be one-offs and small things. But I think it does work better when it's a series of small things that build up. And that's, it's a bit of a platitude, work from the ground up. But I do think diversification works a lot better. And if we're thinking about policy's role in this, and even financial institutions, it is to sit down with those individual business people and make sure they have the resources they need, whether it's capital, whether it's ease of doing business, those kinds of things. But that's not glamorous. It's really kind of day to day, it's relationships. You don't get sort of big wins. There's no ribbon to cut. But I think if we adopt that sense of, you plant each seed, you plow the row, it all builds up. Then you get the big successes. But we always want to start with, we're going to put $5 billion into a waste treatment plant, or we're going to grow oranges in Fort McMurray instead of oil sands. And I think we need to just, if we think smaller, we'll get bigger results. And I know that's rather not very specific. It's more abstract, but I think
you've wandered right into what is ultimately a political debate. Is the shortcut is to go to the source of power and to say to government, look at, here's the future, the headlights are clear, dump money into the future, but you've also pointed out that, change is often requiring an infrastructure to support that change. I mean, when Alan talks about the emergence of fusion energy, we need to almost start talking now about what the infrastructure will require once that research achieves a commercial and viable, because simply having the idea is only the beginning. And we often see that in emerging technologies. We see a spike of interest and then it fades. We saw that with e-commerce. Almost 20 years ago, if you're not in e-commerce, you're going to be out of business next year. Well, it didn't happen because the infrastructure required to support e-commerce wasn't there. Well, today it is. And when COVID hit, bam, it was alive and well, and we're there. But you couldn't have it 20 years ago. You had the idea, but you didn't have the infrastructure to support it. And you also didn't have the market that was ready or forced into it.
And,
so the transition driven by innovation requires a slow and a patient and leadership that can sustain that long run. Ling, if he's still with us, would argue that China is getting it right because they've centralized a lot of the power. And we say, like it or not, we're going to do it, and we're going to be there first and fast. Ling, you want to jump in and make any comments? I'm going to begin to open up discussion now because we've got about 45 minutes. We're halfway there. Ling, you want to make any comments about, what role the individual entrepreneur like yourself needs in order to achieve success? Do you need government as a partner, or just tell government, get the hell out of the way and let me do my thing? And take yourself off mute. Yeah.
Well, for what I do is I create a job for people with autism. Obviously, it's an industry quite a bit different than produce something. But I produce a technology very unique, which I can export to other places. Like I just did this week, I met people in BC. They're very open for this kind of ideas, right? Creating jobs for people, young adults with autism. By the way, I'm a father with a son with autism on the spectrum. So I know this kind of technology is required in many, many places. I'm right now in discussion with United States and other countries. So obviously we need the government to step in because our main buyer is government to pay for this. But if a local government is not going to act, there are other government will act like this. So obviously Alberta can be a bet for developing further technology, which is built in Alberta and export to other places. So we need both government support it and we need the government to purchase it. So that's one way. But I also look at economy as a whole. Just add some comments. Yes, we had a discussion about market pool and democratic system with vote, using vote to do this. But what I see in the last 20, 30 years is too slow. We are in the global economy competing with other people. Singapore is doing well, which is totally centralized economy. China is doing well because they have leaders really push for it. And when they see things not working, they call it stop. They causing society to rethink things very quickly, much faster than we are here. So which way are we going, right? And for what I see is, in order for Canada or for Alberta to be able to compete in the world stage, we have to act like other people. That's my comment.
Okay, so when we look, you mentioned procurement. You didn't use the word, but government as a buyer could help advance innovation if in fact government saw and had a variable in the decision-making process that talked about innovation and economy. But so much of our procurement systems are based on social objectives to make sure we have inclusion. We've got individual rights of certain classes of people that need to be addressed. We seem to have procurement systems that are being built not so much for achieving economic objective, but for achieving social objectives. So Ling, you're in the wrong place.
Well, actually, we talk about a lot of social procurement is lip services. It's not really the social procurement, I'm not sure Duncan is here, Brad Duncan.
Yeah.
I've been working with Brad on this sector, for quite some times. What we see is a lot of talk, lip services, but when actually doing things, it's not a social procurement. We are far away from social procurement. Now we're giving money based on a lot of people crying, different interesting group. We're giving money that way, but we're not actually driving in a top-down holistic approach to address that. So
Well,
I don't.
one of the arguments to fix procurement is to stop itemizing in such incredible detail, but build procurement around the search for solutions as opposed to picking and choosing product. That approach to procurement seems to be making a huge difference in the construction industry. But there seems to be a reluctance to change from buying from the cheapest supplier to buying from a supplier that in fact can help advance and build even more jobs, even more opportunity. So I'm not going to dwell on the procurement issue, but I know that in our survey work, people are very suspicious about government procurement.
I would just mention a couple of things here if I can.
Yeah.
One is I do take to heart, Ling, your comments about how a more centralized government can get things done. I personally, that's my personal opinion, I think the trade-off for what we lose in terms of freedom and the freedom of that we can take advantage both in our personal lives and society, but also if we do innovation and let markets do their work, the democratic liberal system is better. We get it wrong and it does seem worse, but I think you can make a strong argument that if we do liberal democracy right, it is a far better producer of economic prosperity. Second, when we talk about procurement, for me, it leads to, I think, a very unfortunate, this is what often happens is we start to think too local. And during the pandemic, I think it's great to support local farmers. And when the local product or service is good and it makes sense, it's high quality, and all things being equal, why wouldn't you buy from your neighbor? But if it's cheap and shoddy and not as good or more expensive, this is another example. There was a firm that was hired, I think it was by the city of Calgary, goes back about a decade, to do some marketing, some sort of campaign. And they won the bid because they had the best profile, the best idea, and a competitive price. And Calgarians went bananas. Why on earth are you hiring? It was a Toronto firm. This is disgusting. You got to hire the Calgary firm, which didn't have as good of a product. And so it undermines competition, it undermines innovation.
Yeah.
Right, it was the next day, a Calgary company was competing for a project in Toronto and it didn't get it. And the same group of people stood up and said, damn it, we should be able to compete in Toronto. We've got a great product. Why aren't they buying our product? So I think we tend to batten down the hatches and think local. And the same thing with products that I think selling to a Canadian government, they don't have any, we spend lots of money, but we don't actually have any real money to spend on anything new. It's all towards committed projects. It's that international, we have to think about the 8 billion people that are out there and the 250 governments that are out there beyond ours. That's where I would put our focus. And
so two comments
globally.
Two comments there, Robert. One, last week when we had our discussion on governing the digital economy, I think it was Dorothy from Henderson from Toronto who pointed out that young people today, there's a generational split going on. Young people today don't care about privacy, trust, or government intervention. That's not particularly a concern. They're simply happy if they get what they want, what Amazon will give them, what the digitization and the is telling them that they are seeking, and they get it. They're happy. They don't care whether government has gotten involved or whether privacy is being sacrificed, and they don't care about trust. If we have an intergenerational split between where you've been brought up, where I've been brought up, where many people in this group, we do care about privacy, we do care about trust, and we do care about extensive government intervention, but the young generation hasn't even heard about 1984. So we may have evolving, and it would be an evolution, a generation that is prepared to transition and see a world more in line with what Ling sees, which is the government makes things happen, and they don't particularly care about whether or not we're sacrificing privacy or trust along the way. I'm not saying that is the future, but I think there are forces within our world, within Canada, that may well not be carrying the same value set of earlier generations. You might want to comment on that, but that's not necessary. And the other thing I wanted to mention is when I was in Ottawa, I was stunned to realize that the primary objective of government in the economy was to create jobs. And jobs are typically about what we're doing today, not what we're doing tomorrow. And so the government wasn't particularly innovative and isn't particularly innovative when it's looking at my votes in the next 4 years will be a byproduct of creating jobs today. And so I don't see government, the culture of government, the objectives of government, the 4-year cycle of an election necessarily meaning that government is necessarily going to be innovative unless it has a leader. Like we've seen it in history. There have been leaders that had a vision that was 20 years in the making. Maybe it was de Gaulle with the Champs-Élysées, or someone who sees nuclear emerging and is prepared to spend time and effort and budget and votes in championing nuclear. But where to get that long-term leadership from government is one hell of a challenge. Maybe you want to jump in here, Barry. You were a deputy minister within Economic Development Department. We'll blame you for not having thought beyond 4 years. Get off mute, though.
Yeah, okay. Sure, you got to remember that there's very significant pieces to what we're discussing that are in conflict with each other. And I continually raise the issue of the urban-rural split. And we're getting further and further apart from where we're at. Yet our land base is actually, the soils in the West are improving. The demands for food are going up. And it's not just for plants, it's for meats as well. Meats in Asia, and it's much of what we produce in Western Canada creates real income. I say real dollars. They could be real renminbi or whatever. It's additional to just us trading money back and forth with goods and services in our own country. But we turn around and then in the urban, why I say the urban rural split is getting greater. Everybody that's living urban wants to dumb down our very efficient export food industry. And I say food because how many of you know that over the last 20 years, half of the French fries eaten in China were produced in southern Alberta? Just one small example, but I mean, that's one of the big adds to the Chinese diet are French fries. Then you come along with.
Let me interrupt a minute, because the question really was about government and the capacity of government to make a difference in terms of diversification, et cetera. That was not a byproduct of government. That was a byproduct.
Yes, it was.
Of initiative.
I'm sorry.
It
was. The French fry thing was.
Okay, so
the beef thing was.
Let me hear about that.
The French fry one was, government spent a decade trying to attract the major player besides McCain Foods, who would put a domestic plant into the Alberta scene. Spent about a decade getting their major competitor internationally. And the last I saw, they and Conagra split the world market for French fries 50-50, well, 40%, 40%, and then thousands of companies are in the other 20%. And government spent a decade to attract Conagra with an international plant that went in east of Tabor.
Okay,
And
so that was, they assisted in negotiations. They played the role of a party at the table in order to see the pieces fall into place. There wasn't a lot of government spending. There wasn't a program set up to sell potatoes to China.
well, there were, yes, there were, but it wasn't to sell potatoes. It was to treat the effluent. It was to, in a rural setting, it was to treat the effluent so that you had a quality product that equates to anybody. It was to help develop the transportation, the refrigeration transportation of coast and containerization to the marketplace. It was a whole gamut of things. I don't think government is doing those kinds of things to the same degree as they once were. But think about it this way. The pressure that we need to have government try and negate is the pressure on, for instance, the pressure on the domestic market for meats, and particularly for beef. Half of the acreage that we say is agriculture in Alberta is forage land. And we cannot get down on our hands and knees and harvest that. And it's too rocky and too hilly and whatever else. And therefore, it's got to be harvested by the beef bovine animal or alternative other species that don't do nearly as effective a job. We could lose that land. If you go to home-based businesses to produce our food for just our population, and you close down another 50% of the land base, it will impact a whole bunch more of Albertans and Western Canadians than losing a little bit of our energy industry. And we don't get that dialogue going.
Well, you're helping get that dialogue going. I'm going to ask Alan. Well, I think Sharon, you go first, then Alan, I'll call on you next. Go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you. I have got some numbers here to share with everybody. Since April of this past spring, the US, no, these are US numbers, have lost 15 million jobs. 15 million jobs have been lost. People have walked off and quit their jobs. Part of the Great Resignation. At the same time, 10 million jobs are needed to go to work. So what we have here is a survey from Deloitte, who says they agree with government that the greatest thing that concerns the C-suite and the CEOs today is the need to attract talent and keep that talent and the workforce, particularly as we are transitioning into a remote work environment. So I agree with you, Perry, in the sense that market forces are going to shape us as they're going to pull us along. I agree with Ling, because I think we probably need to move faster. And I also agree with Robert that we probably are going to be having, maybe it's okay to grow organically and not look for the next shiny new thing, although we do have to keep our eyes and ears open on that. Consider this, that those 15 million people who have quit their jobs since April are not putting up anymore with low salaries. They're leaving the hospitality industry. We have created slavery. Modern slavery is where we are living in much of the knowledge working conditions. I'm part of the creator economy, and I know that in the last 10 years, this is just a sliver of an example where we had to compete with writing at producing large pieces of writing content for 5 cents. That's where you could go to these writing farms and have to compete against people across the world for to purchase your ability to compose a thought in the written word, in text, and now it's of course in video, and now it's in audio. So we've managed to create a slave economy. Those people are leaving and quitting their jobs, the great resignation we're having to deal with. They can't get people to work for them. And we now have to give them perhaps some solutions, some ideas on how to retain their workforce, their existing workforce, and grow back and refurbish and replenish some loyalty among the people who we partner with, collaborate with, work with. So I'm throwing those thoughts out today. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, I think there's two dimensions to what you referred to. I mean, there are individuals who are thirsting to get back to what they once were doing. That's unlikely. I mean, you know, in the days of the spinning wheel, the spinning wheel was real. You could break as many as you wanted, but the reality was the spinning wheel was coming. And I think with digitization and so many things that are happening, and it's affecting the hospitality industry, you know, Uber isn't going to go away, and self-service isn't going to go away. Market forces are playing a dramatic role, driven by COVID to some extent, of changing the way hospitality, for example, is being delivered. And there are those that will continue to do it the old way that will survive for a while, and that there are those that will begin to introduce robotics or other technologies into that industry. So the individual is either going to become an entrepreneur or become flexible and learn new trades, or he's going to be left on the guaranteed annual income. In our economy, the individual says it's up to the individual to figure what they want to do next. In the Chinese economy, they'll tell you what you're going to do next. I think the opportunity exists. When I hear 15 million people out of jobs, I can look at that as a tragedy or as an opportunity.
Well, if they're trained, because now those people, what are they going to do? Are they going to become self-employed? Are they going to become entrepreneurs? Are they going to go to work for somebody else who will pay them more? That's not going to happen, probably. Although some are.
In the world that we're going into, it's not 15 million, it is 15 million. Each one is an individual that will likely make a decision, and they need assistance as an individual in making that. We do not need a program for 15 million people. How do we think differently now that we have the tools that we've never had before to be able to address the needs of 15 million individuals? And that's what Brett gets into when he talks about the economy of one. So exciting. I mean, I think you've touched on you summarized what is a dramatic moment that we're going through today, driven to some extent by COVID, but also being driven by technology. It isn't just COVID that knocked 15 million off employment. It's what new technologies are doing as well.
Right.
So when we listen to Robert and we hear literally everybody in this room, we're excited about what innovation may mean, but there are those that are terrified what innovation may mean, because it means they have to go learn again. If there's any body that is most reluctant to go learn, it's the professional who's making a bunch of money today with a license on the wall that is told you need to engage in continuous learning.
Well, I can tell you that I've been talking about the new social audio platforms that have come into existence, which that means Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces, Deep Dive, and a host of others. And this is where we can, this is where we listen rather than see each other visually. But the volume of people on those calls worldwide are, so many of them are trying to set up businesses for themselves. It's kind of painful to listen to, because most of them are going to go broke before they have the ability to find sustainability in their lives.
Before I go to Alan, because I want to come to Robert for a moment, because I did indicate I would come back to banking. I mean, some might want to ask Robert today, is the bank manager in St. Albert ready to help the innovator today who says, look, I'm one of those 15 million, but I have an idea and I need a partner, and my partner is my banker. Are your bankers today familiar with the fact that we're entering into a different world? And if that guy wants to make hamburgers, he's probably in the old economy. But if he wants to get involved in something in e-commerce where he's selling hamburgers online or whatever, how is ATB or how is the banking industry itself adapting to the various changes that we've talked about?
Another great question, Barry. I can speak a little bit about ATB and also financial sector in general. On the one hand, there is intense awareness of exactly what you're talking about. And running alongside that is how open banking and what consumers want from their bank or who they bank with, and new competitors coming in like the Googles and Amazon and Walmart. All of this happening, a lot of change in financial services in a very traditional sector, especially the banking piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And large ships that are difficult to turn. So on the bright side, and I think ATB, we have some advantages in terms of our ability to move quickly, trying to stay on top of those trends so that we have the digital capacity, the technology, and how we can move from, in the old days, you come into the branch, you got a business plan and a duotang, and you throw it on the desk and you say, I've done my research and I need, $50,000 of capital to get started, and you work out a deal, versus people who are coming in with ideas that we might be completely unfamiliar with. How is that going to work? Where's the market for that? Because it's new or it's different. That's always been a problem, but I think that's been exacerbated. So on the one hand, I think the financial sector is trying to adapt, trying to move with these changes, but we're still highly regulated, and for good reason. We have to be very careful with the capital in terms of the risk we're allowed to take. So we might see more groups coming into these spaces that are able to take that risk and find a way to make it work. So I think there's a lot of positives, but it's going to take time, and it's going to be a bumpy road for the banking sector to keep up with those changes. And I'll just mention, it's a bit gloomy, but unless we start to figure out some of this stuff, there's a large segment of the Canadian population, the United States, really all the industrialized countries, that are going to be completely left behind by the changes that are sweeping with the current technology.
Right.
Education has a huge role, both in our younger years. You mentioned continuing to learn. We all face this, but in particular, if you're tired of working at McDonald's, and I don't blame you, I love McDonald's, and some people make great careers out of it. But in general, if there's jobs that are not satisfying or not paying well, they're going nowhere, there's no benefits, I don't blame people for not wanting to do that at all. The problem is those jobs are the easiest ones to replace. They used to be the hardest. How am I going to get somebody to do this? Yeah. And we don't have robots around every corner yet. Right. That's not happening, but it's getting that much closer. And it's that group that are going to have the largest barriers to education, to that lifelong learning, so we've got a real challenge as a society, because it doesn't help us if our kids learn coding and find a way to make that gig economy, which doesn't seem to work for most people, to actually work, and we get financial institutions to be able to fund that kind of new thinking. Unless you can get into that group, and it's a tough group to break into, we're going to see even more social problems. And it's a gloomy prognosis. I apologize for that, but there's a lot of arrows pointing to that, where the gap will get larger. So that's not so much on the financial institutions, but I do think as a sector, to bring it back, we are trying to stay ahead of these things, but it's difficult. It's difficult to change.
I mean, I've seen in the banking industry a number of things that relate to the status quo, and one is the introduction of relationship managers who go out of their way today to have a discussion with me as an individual or you as an individual, so you can feel the person. Even they put little lamps, they do a lot of things in the environment to make the environment feel more comfortable. They have individual rooms that you go to meet with your banker, et cetera, et cetera. But that's old banking. That's very much based on relationships. Is digitization affordable? if in fact we're moving to a world where it's all the data that you know, because you see their credit card transactions and you see their spending transactions, you have a lot of information about the individual. So the digitization of your world means that you may get into more than just banking in order to see that person as someone who you want to work with, and banking may be your ultimate interest, but there may be other things that you need to do in banking that you've never done before in order to retain that relationship. Is that the way banking is beginning to think, and constrained only by the damn archaic regulations that say, no, you have to stay within the traditional siloed sector of finance?
All that's happening, and it's happening sort of, it's a duality, because you've got on the one hand, and banking's not unique here, how do we actually develop meaningful human relationships that aren't just, superficial, while we are moving at light speed on technology that separates us from each other, and a customer base that might be saying, I don't have any loyalty to a bank. I don't want to be part of a bank. I just want my transactions to be quick and on my phone, which has no, so it's that, the arguments about artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics, there's going to be a space for the human element that becomes even more important. But while at the same time, we're moving away from that. And I think it's a huge challenge. But I think, at ATB, I can speak for us, we are very much focused on being customer client obsessed in ways that we weren't in the, that actually are made possible by the technology. And you also mentioned this, another huge theme, which is what do we do with all this data, big data? And I've been a bit of a skeptic because I don't know enough about it. It's easy to be a skeptic, but how you actually manage that in a way that is appropriate, that isn't cold and impersonal, that meshes with that relationship side. And I don't think big companies, I'll pick on like a Facebook or those kind of companies, they're not managing it very well at all. And so I think that's the challenge, whether you're a bank or whether you're a hotel or you name it. There's a lot of other industries not as affected, but we'll all be affected in one way or the other.
Well, I just by the sheer nature of what, quote, is an economy, which is an interaction between individuals at one level or another, even in commodities. It is becoming increasingly about relationships. When Barry talked about how we entered into a market of selling potatoes into China, he talked about people. How people are going to adapt to the environment, the new environment that we're going into, the environment that we're already in, actually. I mean, data is becoming the new commodity. I have one more question I'm going to ask you, Robert, because I think it is very much related to what could be a major overhaul of the banking industry, much like what fusion could be in energy. Is cryptocurrency on its way? I learned this week, as we all did, that China has banned cryptocurrency in its current form, but successively said, we're launching our own cryptocurrency, implying that the dollar, which has a number on it today, or the loonie that has a number on it today, or I guess it's the $5 bill, has a number on it today, which is the only thing that distinguishes it from another number. And it's simply a reflection of trust that will be honored. Cryptocurrency isn't a heck of a lot different. It's simply a number that someone put a value around and trust that number is redeemable. Is cryptocurrency the future?
Well, I have to say two things before, two caveats. One, I don't know anywhere near enough about cryptocurrency. I'm largely in the dark. And second, don't take any of this as financial advice because I guarantee it's wrong.
Right.
I'm mystified by cryptocurrency. I'm mystified by the original Bitcoin was meant to be this rogue outside government, outside the markets. And it's turned into this weird commodity that people are trading, and it's become, another form of gold or something. Then there's we already have currency that seems to work pretty well. Bitcoin was great if you wanted to do something illegal, but we have governments that produce legal tender. So, but I think the digitization of it, I mean, that's going to happen. We're not going to be carrying around cash that's already rapidly. Not that many years ago, we would have said we'll never get rid of the penny. We might not have any paper money in a few years. So I think the technology is going to continue to evolve, the blockchain and so forth. But whether crypto, like all these varieties of currencies and how they're traded, that's over my head. I honestly don't understand.
Mine too, Robert. But what caught my attention, and it comes back to Ling and watching what's happening on a worldwide, if someone says at a national level that a sovereign state will launch its own cryptocurrency, it's no different than having a rupee or a krona.
So, do you want me to comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
So
And then I'll come to you,
cryptocurrency,
Alan, don't leave. I will be back to you. We've gotten into a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I'll get out of it in a minute. Go ahead, Ling.
so the Chinese government see cryptocurrency as a threat to a national sovereignty, to their, basically how they control the economy. So in China, cryptocurrency become a channel for people wash money or transfer money in a way government control. So that's why government is cutting the leg off, and they see that as more as a sovereignty. So they basically say, we're not going to let another form or another, whoever
Right.
controls
Right.
to control our economy. So we're going to launch our own digital economy. And the second thing is you probably see China have a huge power shortage. So they want to get rid of all the farming, the mining industry in China and throw them out. Basically, they want to use the power for their own things.
Right.
So they basically, and that's what I'm saying is China make things go very fast. Now, I made a comment to you early last week. They're not afraid of making mistakes. And that's one thing what I see here is we talk for 10 years, try to do the right things. Meanwhile, people made a 5 move already.
Yeah. No, we're not arguing. We're all witnessing and watching a war that's underway called by some evolution and by others revolution. But regardless, I guess just depends upon where you sit in the whole exercise. Now, Alan, you're toying with a technology that has actually more potential influence than cryptocurrency and all of the rest of the things we've talked about combined. So I suspect you've got a question that relates something to your particular position and advocacy. So go ahead, Alan.
Well, first of all, sitting back, can you hear me okay?
Too well.
Too well. Okay. Let me talk in the comfort of my chair. I want to pick a provocative moment with you to leave you to think about. And there's been much discussion around this idea of picking winners and procurement. And first of all, my idea of picking winners is not for every little individual idea and person that comes along. It's big thematic areas and who's got the solution space for large themes. So I like picking winners. The second is procurement. If you look at the history of the really big moves, not just technology, I look at the US, they use procurement to pick winners and drive large change. China doing exactly the same. And China, in fact, as you know, through their 5 and 10 and 20-year plans have identified a number of themes, and they pour the resources in and they move quickly and they're solving problems. We have not come to grips with that in Canada. And until we do, I'm sorry, we're not going to go anywhere. We need to start picking winners in thematic areas and backing them. And I'll take a few examples here. We've got a fusion company in Canada, the one company, General Fusion, based in Burnaby, and they've managed to, through private sector investment, $200-300 million investment. But moving to the next stage, it's even bigger money. They weren't able to get the backing in Canada. They are now going to go and build their demonstration plant in the UK. And why? Because the UK has come out and said, we're going to make fusion energy one of our big forward-going initiatives. Canada should have done this, and we could have done it a long time ago. We're not in that game. And you can pick other areas. The last real champion we had in Canada was C.D. Howe back in the 50s when we got into nuclear energy and AVROs and low-cost loans to get the housing system going and so on. We did a lot of innovative things with big vision at the time. We have lost that capability now, and we really need to change. So I would say picking winners, but thematically, not just every little idea that comes along, but thematically picking winners and using procurement, and that implies large government funding to make the big ones go, because all the big ideas take big money.
Okay,
And
Alan,
we are not facing up to it.
Alan, I've got 3 minutes and I think I can figure out how to bring this to a closure in 3 minutes, but I'm going to ask you one question that's very related to the closure. What constitutes a winner?
Well, there's several things. We can see it. We've already made reference to agriculture and so on. We know we're moving to new agricultural things. It's got to be getting off the land and getting into vertical growing space and so on. We know in energy, we have to leave the fossil fuels behind. We may not like it, but that's what's going to happen. Climate change is dictating it. We've got to decarbonize. And by mid-century, we're going to be going in a different direction. Energy is at the root of it. You've got renewables, you've got fission, and you've got fusion. I'm arguing you're going to have all three of them to the maximum that all can be developed and exploited. But certainly for the long run, fusion is going to be the ultimate game. So there's two. There's healthcare and all its implications with data and tele and so on. But you can pick any number of theme areas.
So if I'm a leader and I'm following the mantra of picking a winner, I want to pick a winner that is going to bring me economic benefit in the long haul and also reduce risk. So in a world threatened or believing that we have an existential threat around climate change, you'd probably align with what you're talking about in the long haul. Is we've got to know a lot more and make damn sure we invest in something like fusion or like nuclear that doesn't have emissions associated with it and will in fact be affordable. And I'm going to get some votes out of this, because the winner to the politician is a vote. So therein lies how you sell to a politician your view of the new future, of a winning future. Is you've got to figure out how to sell in such a way that it's going to generate a vote in the long haul or a sustained way. Mm-hmm. Now we're into wrap up, 20 seconds by my calendar. Robert, I've got a concluding comment I'd like to make in addition to thank you and all of you who showed up today. I mean, this was exciting, and it has been recorded, and Alona, I see you nodding your head, so I know we got a winner today. I think we wrapped up on a point that Alan just made, which is whether we're talking about a resilient economy, whether or not we're talking about the role of government, whether we're talking about innovation, it all ultimately boils down to, in a world of rapid change, it's going to boil down to leadership and the capacity to manage change, sustain that role as a leader, to have a vision, to be articulate, to retain, as Robert put it, that customer relationship during transition, to listen carefully to innovation. I think these are the things we've talked about today, and they do all come together. But technology and change is all about how do you manage it? How do you achieve it? How do you sustain it until you get to the goal?